Something fundamental just shifted in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. And I am not talking about a new piece of evidence, or a forensic development, or a suspect being named. I am talking about something structural. Something that changes who is actually running this investigation, who is actually in control, and what the relationship between the people searching for Nancy and the family, desperate to find her, actually looks like on day 104. Because this week, Sheriff Chris Nanos of Pima County sat down with People magazine. And buried inside that interview, between the standard reassurances and the carefully worded optimism, he said something that stopped veteran reporters and law enforcement analysts cold. He said he is no longer directly communicating with the Guthrie family. Those conversations, he told People magazine, are now being handled entirely by the FBI. Let that register. The sheriff of Pima County, the man whose department caught this case on night one, whose face has been at every press conference, whose agency has never officially handed jurisdiction to the federal government, is admitting publicly on the record, in a national magazine, that the family of the missing woman at the center of his investigation is no longer talking to him. They are talking to the FBI, only the FBI. And when you understand what that means, not emotionally, but operationally, procedurally, in terms of what it reveals about where this investigation actually stands and who the Guthrie family trusts to bring their mother home, the entire picture of this case rearranges itself around that single admission. There is a lot to get through today. The DNA timeline is narrowing. A former investigator with over 40 years of experience has offered a theory about the doorbell footage that reframes everything we thought we understood about the figure at Nancy's door. The sheriff used the words "cold case" out loud for the first time, and the silence of a $1.2 million reward sitting unclaimed for over 100 days is becoming its own form of evidence. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, because this case is approaching a threshold, and the next development could be the one that breaks it open. Let me walk you through everything. To understand why the sheriff's admission about family communication matters as much as it does, you need to understand what it signals inside the mechanics of a major investigation. Morgan Wright is a former investigator and law enforcement expert with over 4 decades of experience. He has been analyzing this case alongside journalist Brian Enton, who has covered the Guthrie disappearance since day one and has become one of the most reliable ground-level voices in this story. And when Morgan Wright heard that Nanos is no longer in direct contact with the family, his assessment was blunt. He said in his entire career, it is unusual for the originating agency, the department that holds investigative authority, the one whose jurisdiction the case technically belongs to not be communicating with the victim's family. That is not normal. That is not how major cases are supposed to work. And he said it could mean one of two things. Either something significant is happening behind the scenes at the federal level, something advanced enough, something sensitive enough, that the FBI has taken over family communications because the case has entered a phase that falls squarely within federal expertise, advanced forensic developments, intelligence operations, the kind of work that requires federal handling and federal security protocols. Or it means the relationship between the sheriff and the Guthrie family has deteriorated to the point where the FBI stepped in, because trust no longer exists between the family and the local agency that was supposed to protect their mother. Both of those explanations are alarming, and both of them might be true simultaneously. Because here is the context that surrounds this admission. Over 100 days of investigation with no arrest, no named suspect, no confirmed proof of life. A Pima County Board of Supervisors that compelled the sheriff to give sworn testimony under oath. A bipartisan group of county supervisors publicly calling for Nanos' resignation. Reports that the case has already cost Pima County approximately $1 million. Money that a county supervisor named Dr. Matha Hines has said could have been saved if the FBI had been allowed to lead from the beginning, using federal funding and federal resources. And on the other side of that ledger, FBI Director Kash Patel publicly stating that his agency was ready to take the lead from night one, with hundreds of agents, with fixed-wing aircraft, with the most advanced forensic laboratory in the country, and that the sheriff said no. Nanos pushed back on Patel's characterization in the People interview. He said coordination with the FBI began soon after learning of Nancy's disappearance. He said the FBI was with them from day one. He said Director Patel has his right to his opinions, but that some of those remarks were factually inaccurate. But here is the thing about competing narratives between a county sheriff and a federal agency director. At some point, the record resolves the contradiction. And the record right now shows a family that has stopped talking to the sheriff entirely. The family has voted with their silence, and what they voted for is the FBI. Morgan Wright made a point about this that deserves to sit with you. He said when you are working a major case, you always want to maintain contact with the family. Always. Because when a case gets built, when it goes to trial, you need their cooperation. You need their testimony. You need them invested in the process. And if you have spent over 100 days allowing that trust to erode to the point where they only communicate through a federal intermediary, you have created a structural problem for yourself that extends far beyond the investigation. The sheriff is technically still in charge. The FBI is actually running things, and everyone who matters knows it. Now let me get into the DNA, because what Nanos said about it this week is simultaneously the most hopeful and the most sobering thing that has come out of this investigation in months. Here is his direct statement to People magazine. He said they have DNA from an unknown contributor, someone whose identity has not been established, and that he believes the labs are getting closer to identifying who that person is. He expressed confidence in the labs, and then he said something that landed with weight. He said if the labs come back and tell them there is nothing else they can do, then maybe they have a cold case. Cold case. The sheriff of Pima County said those words publicly for the first time since Nancy Guthrie disappeared 104 days ago. Now, let me break both sides of that statement apart because both matter. The optimistic side first. When Nanos says, getting closer, that phrasing suggests something specific about where the forensic process actually stands. Morgan Wright explained it clearly. He said the DNA analysis itself is probably already complete. What is likely happening now is the genealogy phase, the painstaking work of building family trees from partial DNA matches, working outward from second and third cousin connections in public databases, narrowing candidates through the branching logic of inherited genetic material. This is the work being done by C.C. Moore and Estraa Forensics. The hair sample recovered from Nancy's property was sent to Quantico and to Estraa in mid-April. Morgan Wright said the genealogy phase typically takes 60 to 90 days to produce meaningful results. 60 to 90 days from mid-April puts the window at mid-June to mid-July. We may be approaching the point where that work begins producing a name. C.C. Moore does not fail quietly. When that organization is involved in a case, results tend to follow. The science is real. It has solved cases that sat cold for decades. And if the hair sample recovered from Nancy's property produces viable DNA, and that DNA produces a genealogical pathway to a specific individual, this case could break open rapidly. But now the sobering side. Because Nanos also acknowledged publicly that if the labs produce nothing actionable, this investigation may stall into cold case territory. And sources close to the investigation have been telling Brian Enton the same thing, that the DNA is essentially what the case is riding on right now. No dominant lead, no solid suspect. The investigation at this point is waiting on the lab, and Morgan Wright added context that tempers the optimism further. He said DNA does not come with a date and timestamp. A hair found at a crime scene does not tell you when it was deposited or under what circumstances. And given that the crime scene was uncontrolled during the chaotic first days of the investigation, Sergeant Aaron Cross himself used the word chaotic to describe that period. There is a real possibility that the DNA was introduced by someone who had legitimate access to the property in the days surrounding Nancy's disappearance, not by the person responsible for taking her. Even if the genealogy work produces a name, that name still has to be placed in context. It still has to be corroborated by independent evidence. It still has to survive the challenge that a competent defense attorney would immediately mount. The DNA is the best thread this investigation has, but it is also right now the only thread. And the sheriff just told the world that if it breaks, there may not be another one behind it. Now I need to spend time on something Morgan Wright said this week that fundamentally reframes the doorbell footage. Because for over 100 days, the public debate about the figure captured at Nancy's front door has centered on one question. Was he trying to hide his face? Morgan Wright has a different answer, and it is not based on speculation. He was explicit about that. It is based on training, on decades of investigative experience, and on real case data about how criminal operations are planned and executed. He said the figure at the door was not worried about being identified. He was wearing a mask. He was covered head to toe. His face was already concealed. A masked figure on a doorbell camera is a problem for investigators, yes, but it is a manageable problem. You cannot identify a masked person from doorbell footage alone. The face was already handled. What the figure was worried about, Morgan Wright concluded, was the vehicle. Here is the logic. A vehicle is identifiable in ways that a masked human body is not. A vehicle has a make, a model, a year, a color. It might have a partial plate visible. A distinctive feature, a dent, a rack, a sticker, a bumper modification. Any one of those details captured on camera gives law enforcement a thread to pull, a DMV database search, a reverse lookup, the kind of investigative trace that Morgan Wright described from his own career, a case where a single piece of a vehicle's grille from a hit and run was enough to identify the year, make, model, and partial VIN number. And from that single fragment, they found the car. Now apply that to Nancy's doorstep. The blood trail from inside the home leads to the curb. It stops at the exact position where a vehicle would need to be staged for a person to be loaded in. That is not circumstantial. That is the physical record of what happened. Nancy was put into a vehicle at that curb, and that vehicle drove away. The figure at the door, the flashlight in his mouth, the vegetation stuffed over the camera lens, the time spent ensuring the camera could not record, was not protecting his identity. His identity was already protected by the mask and the clothing. He was protecting the car, because the car was the single most traceable element of the entire operation. One clear frame of that vehicle on that doorbell camera, and investigators would have had a make, model, and color within hours. Possibly a plate, possibly enough for a DMV trace that leads to a registered owner within 24 hours. That is not someone who stumbled into this crime. That is someone who understood how vehicle identification works in law enforcement and planned around it with a level of operational thinking that speaks to either experience or extremely careful preparation. And that vehicle analysis connects to something else Morgan Wright raised, the egress problem. The question of where the vehicle went after it left Nancy's curb. Nanos told People magazine that his department is working through thousands and thousands of videos from intersections and ring cameras, cataloging vehicles by type and color, so they can cross-reference when a suspect is eventually identified. Morgan Wright said that approach is inverted. Instead of cataloging everything and waiting for a name, start with what you already know. You know Nancy's pacemaker sync stopped at 2:28 in the morning. You know from accelerometer data that she was likely in motion between approximately 2:12 and 2:28. That is your window. Pull every vehicle captured in motion within a reasonable radius of her home during those 16 minutes. That is a dramatically smaller universe than every vehicle on every camera from that entire night. Then map the egress routes, south toward Interstate 19, the corridor toward Nogales, the route toward the border. Identify which vehicles were moving through those corridors during the relevant window. Eliminate the ones that don't fit, wrong direction, wrong size, wrong timing. Keep narrowing until you have a manageable subset of vehicles that were physically capable of being at Nancy's curb at the right time and moving in a direction consistent with departure. And then, and this is the part that should make anyone following this case pay very close attention, cross-reference those vehicles against border crossing records. If any vehicle from that egress window also appears at a border crossing within a plausible time frame, an hour and a half to 2 hours later, accounting for drive time and a possible cooling-off period, that overlap becomes enormously significant. That is not speculation. That is physics and logistics applied to a defined time window. And it is the kind of analysis that turns thousands of videos into a handful of genuine candidates. Morgan Wright also addressed the question that has divided experts since this investigation began. Was this one person or two? The two-person theory has credible support. The rear floodlights at Nancy's home were smashed at the same time the front doorbell camera was being covered. two simultaneous actions at two separate entry points, suggesting two people operating in coordination. The logistics of taking an 84-year-old woman against her will, managing her physically, transporting her to a vehicle, driving away. Those requirements are easier to execute with two people than one. But Morgan Wright raised a counterpoint that is hard to dismiss. He pointed to the silence of the reward. $1.2 million has been sitting on the table, publicly available, for over 100 days. And nobody has claimed it. Nobody has called. Nobody has come forward. His argument is simple. Two people cannot keep a secret. Not under this much pressure. Not with this much money available. Not for this long. If two people were involved, the math says one of them should have cracked by now. One of them should have weighed the reward against the risk of staying silent and made a call. The fact that the phone has not rung is, in Morgan Wright's assessment, the loudest argument for a single offender in the entire case. A lone operator. Someone carrying this alone. Someone who does not have a partner whose loyalty they have to worry about. Someone who may not even be from the Tucson area. A traveling offender with no local footprint, no prior contacts in the Pima County system, no field interview cards, no intelligence file. Someone who came in, executed this operation, and left. And there is nothing organic in the local law enforcement ecosystem to pull them back into view. That theory also explains why the doorbell footage has not produced an identification despite being seen by millions of people. If the person is not from the community, nobody in the community would recognize their build, their gait, their posture. The mask conceals the face, the clothing conceals the body, and the vehicle, the one element that could be definitively identified, was deliberately hidden from the camera. And then Morgan Wright said something that deserves to be addressed directly, because it is the most unflinching assessment of this case that has been spoken publicly by anyone with his level of credibility. He called this a nobody homicide, not a missing person case, not a kidnapping for ransom, a homicide. He believes Nancy Guthrie is no longer alive and that the investigation should be operating from that premise. His reasoning is clinical and it is grounded in the evidence. Nancy is 84 years old. She has a cardiac condition. She was taken in the early morning hours under violent circumstances. Blood at the front entrance, blood trailing to the curb. Medication critical to her survival was left sitting on the counter inside her home. The ransom notes that appeared went to media outlets, not directly to the family. Inconsistent with a genuine ransom operation. The Bitcoin wallet specified in those notes has never been touched. Not a single transaction. All of it, in his assessment, points not to a living person being held somewhere awaiting payment, but to a crime that was completed on the night of January 31st. Now, law enforcement has not publicly declared Nancy dead. The family has not declared her dead. And there are voices, including Elizabeth Smart, who survived her own abduction and has said publicly that Nancy could still be alive. That perspective deserves respect and space. But Morgan Wright's assessment reflects what multiple law enforcement professionals have been saying privately for weeks. And if he is right, if this is a homicide investigation rather than a missing person search, it changes the entire operational focus. From finding a living person to building a prosecutable case. From rescue to accountability. And that shift, quiet as it may be exactly why the FBI has taken over all communications with the Guthrie family. Because what the FBI may be building right now is not a search plan. It is a prosecution. Here is where everything stands on day 104. The sheriff is no longer talking to the Guthrie family. The FBI is. That tells you who is actually driving this investigation regardless of what the jurisdictional paperwork says. The DNA is at Quantico. CC Moore and Estraa Forensics are doing the genealogy work. The 60 to 90-day window from mid-April puts us potentially within weeks of a result. But the sheriff himself has acknowledged that if the labs come back empty, this case may go cold. Everything rides on what that hair sample produces. The vehicle theory reframed the doorbell footage entirely. The figure was not hiding his face. He was hiding the car. And the car, through egress mapping and border crossing analysis, may still be traceable if the right time window methodology is applied. The reward, $1.2 million, sits untouched after more than 100 days. And that silence is either evidence of a disciplined single offender or the prelude to someone's nerve finally breaking. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker is still running, still logging. still counting every second since 2:28 on the morning of February 1st. The entire truth of what happened to her after that timestamp is stored inside a device the size of a small matchbox, implanted in the chest of a woman whose family has not stopped searching for a single day. Savannah Guthrie posted on Mother's Day, 100 days in. She wrote, "Mother, daughter, sister, Nan, we miss you with every breath. We will never stop looking for you. We will never be at peace until we find you. 104 days. The FBI is running this now. The DNA is being processed. CeCe Moore does not quit. And somewhere, a vehicle that left Nancy's curb in the darkness of that February morning exists in a database, on a camera frame, in a border crossing log, waiting to be found by someone asking the right question at the right time. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, call 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can remain completely anonymous. The reward is real. The investigation is active. And Nancy is still out there. Share this video. Keep her name in front of every algorithm, every feed, every conversation, because someone out there knows something, and the weight of what they are carrying gets heavier every single day they stay silent. We will see you in the next one. Stay with this case.